The story begins at night with a view of a huge castle. It's the first night as crown princess for the main character. Suddenly, she awoke last night hearing some shouting, so she immediately asked her maid what it was. Calmly looking at her maid, the protagonist didn't understand what had happened, why she had suddenly started screaming. However, the protagonist actually looked to the side and saw a man who had died, and she probably did it because she still had a small blade in her hands. At that moment, the girl realized she had dealt with the crown prince, and at that moment, she became an assassin. The crown prince hated her, he wouldn't even let her touch him, and always talking tough, never smiling back at her. There were even moments where the main character regretted being his fiancée, but as she pictured the faces of her parents and brother, who were more proud, the girl wanted more and more to be a princess that the people would love. But for some reason something went wrong and she ended up imprisoned. She didn't understand why she was accused of killing the prince when she didn't actually do it. Suddenly, some girl with red hair noticed the main character and shouted her name. Benity. Girl was very surprised that she was in prison. That girl was Rosalie, who was interested in how the main character was feeling and whether she was okay. Screaming in fear, Beniti replied that no one here listened to her, and she just drank the wine the maid of honor had given her, and then she went straight to sleep. Hearing this, Rosalie immediately asked her friend if she was hungry. Also, holding out the food, the girl advised the protagonist to eat, since she was most likely very hungry, which made Beniti very happy. But the red-haired girl, instead of giving the main character a proper meal, pretended to accidentally drop the sandwich on the ground, and then she stepped on it right away and ruined this beautiful, tasty sandwich, which surprised the main character, and she didn't understand why her friend was doing this to her and why she was doing this in the first place. To which Rosalie replied that now she was happy to look at Beniti, the place she will get a decent place. Besides, she was very disgusted to hear the main character complain that she does not like her position. Looking the girl straight in the eyes, Rosalie replied that she had been waiting for this moment for a long time, and now she realized that it had been worth it. Then the protagonist starts screaming at her hysterically, asking her friend what she's talking about and why she did it. But Rosalie, laughing loudly, replied that now Beniti would be executed, and she would suffer long and die in agony. Also kicking that sandwich, Rosalie wished the protagonist to enjoy it well, since it may likely be the last meal for her. As she left, the girl added that she was pleased to know that Beniti's last supper was made by her, and then she left. At that moment, the main character began to ask Rosalie what will happen to her parents, and whether they will suffer from it, to which Rosalie turned around and replied that she herself will soon find out everything. After a while, Beniti was already in the center of the city, where next to her were two knights who held swords pointed at her. You could hear how the crowd wanted to get rid of the princess who killed the heir of the prince. They also called her a witch. Rosalie is a simple princess who would not be able to pull off such a thing alone. Also, it was very interesting when it had time to start. Meanwhile, the knights were pointing with their hands to some carriage on which were some sort of... The main character was shocked to see the contents of this carriage. It was her parents that the imperial family had dealt with. Crying, the girl did not understand what her family had done to her, or why they had done this to her. Just as the knights were about to swing their sword in preparation to end his life forever, Beniti remembered something. She remembered being in prison and some girl in a white outfit came to her holding a scroll. She immediately explained to the girl that she didn't have time, so she should listen carefully. The mysterious girl explained to Beniti that she was about to be shot, so she must take these notes that are written in this paper language to bake this song during the execution. This item can change an unfair fate, so she should make no mistake if she wants to turn back time. At that moment, the protagonist started singing this song loudly, saying she wouldn't let herself be victimized by betrayal. Also remembering her dead parents and how she had been unfairly treated, her hands began to glow with a yellow light, and she began to slowly lose consciousness. Suddenly, she's just in her bed, realizing that she's got a new life given to her by this song. Meanwhile, the maid who had screamed in fear at the beginning when she saw the dead heir was now also worried about the main character because she thought she would never wake up again. Hearing that angelic voice, the protagonist immediately hugged the maid, calling her Tasha, and the protagonist was glad that it was all a dream, which left the maid a little perplexed, for she thought Beniti had just had a terrible nightmare. Then, thinking about it, the protagonist even began to doubt that it was a dream, since she had a bad memory of singing that song before she was executed. Suddenly, looking to the side, the girl saw her brother, who was also happy to see that his favorite sister had opened her eyes again. At that moment, Benity immediately hugged him. However, the guy were a little perplexed and asked the maid, "What is it with Benity?" The girl replied that she herself did not know. Touching his sister's hands, the guy tried to calm her down, saying he'd made her fall off the horse. She was asleep for a long time after the fall, so she probably just had a bad nightmare, and she could still have some serious trauma. Suddenly thoughtful, and the protagonist finally remembered what really happened. Namely, at 17, she fell off a horse and sprained her ankle. At the time, she was chosen to be the heir prince's bride candidate. Also, she finally realized that the song she sang worked, and she went back in time. And in fact, the princess, when she asked her to sing that song, didn't fool her. But Benity thought it was really just some horrible dream. But she immediately felt a strange feeling and remembered a knight holding a sword and swinging it at her, preparing to deal with her. So the protagonist realized it was real. The witch's song gave her a second chance to change her fate, but Benity remembers that the mysterious girl who is a princess told her that the prince had these notes, which is very strange, and maybe he knew what would happen. Clenching her fist tightly, Benity thought Rosalie blatantly who she considered her only true friend. So the protagonist didn't understand why she chose to betray her. Suddenly, her brother, who was still worried about her, asked her why she was staring at nothing for so long and what she was thinking about, to which the protagonist replied that it was all nothing. At that moment, the boyfriend advised her to go to bed and get some rest because her parents were worried about her. When the protagonist heard that, she immediately remembered how her parents died in her past life. So, yelling at her brother, who was totally confused, she asked him, "Where are the parents?" To which he replied that they were outside talking to the doctor. So Benity immediately ran out of her room and ran to her father, who also missed his daughter very much, to hug him. Suddenly, the mother who was in the day understood why the Duke's daughter can run barefoot in the garden. In addition to this, main character has an injury, so she is not allowed to move at all. However, the mother immediately forgot all about it and hugged her daughter, whom she also missed very much, and worriedly asked her if she was too frightened. Hugging her mother, Benity had already promised herself, and that she would not let it happen a second time. And it was in this life that the crown prince, whose name is Karzan, was cold and cruel to her. So she would no longer be only a pathetic and bride to him. Smiling and looking at her brother, the protagonist decided that she would fix everything as the princess had asked. She also decided that first she needed to find the people who wanted to get rid of her family so they could be held accountable. After a while, dressed in a modest, beautiful dress and being in a carriage, the girl thought that it was not easy for her to become the crown princess. Because out of many girls from prestigious families, he chooses the 3 most suitable. But in the end, only one girl becomes the prince's chosen one. After 2 years of education, she is married at the age of 20 and enters the Ruby Palace, which is their common residence with the prince. Such is the way of becoming a crown princess. In this life, Benity has a selection ceremony starting in 2 days. At that moment, the girl got out of her carriage and was in front of some huge building called Marianne's Boutique. Marianne Isabel is the best designer in the empire. Entering the boutique, the protagonist immediately met a bunch of maids who immediately bowed down to her. Approaching one of them, Benity said she was looking for a dress for the bride's selection ceremony, to which the maid replied that they would get Marianne right away. After a while being in the living room, the protagonist was waiting for Marianne. Suddenly, she finally heard the voice of the designer who was honored to meet Benity. Looking at Benity and bowing to her, the designer smilingly said that they had seen each other only a year ago, and she was very surprised at how big the protagonist had become. To which the girl immediately agreed, adding that she and her mom had visited the designer at the mansion. At which point, the protagonist said she'd like to stop making her dress, which surprised the designer, and she apologized, saying that it was the Duchess's order and they can't just break the deal. To which the protagonist sipped tea and replied that she wasn't going to wear the dress anyway, but she wouldn't cross her mom. Marianne was a little shocked at the straightness of the main character. She also did not understand why Benity does not want to wear her dress, since the other candidates already have elegant dresses. At that moment, putting a cup of tea on the table, the protagonist realized that she would have to wear a dress, and she asked if it was possible to show her something more fashionable, since she was looking for the most fancy clothes. Beniti also added that she wanted her dress to be eye-catching as well. Then the designer immediately took the girl to her room where they started looking at all the dresses Marianne has. Suddenly, the main character noticed one very interesting dress, and she wondered what it was, to which the designer replied that this dress is called a golden wave. So when the girl heard that, she said she wanted the dress, even though she knows her mom will scream when she finds out what she's wearing. But by then the ceremony is over. Meanwhile, the main character walks away looking the designer straight in the eye. However, Marianne smirked and glared at the protagonist with a sinister look, as if she was up to something. After a while, the protagonist was already in her mansion, when suddenly her maid noticed something very interesting in the street, which is where the carriage that was recognized by the imperial family for the Beniti. Tasha also added that the ceremony was just around the corner, and she was very curious what it would be like to ride in that carriage. When the protagonist looked at this one, she started remembering all the misfortunes that happened to her after riding in this carriage. Looking at Tasha, who was rejoicing greatly, Beniti let her rejoice if she wanted to, since in any case the events that happened to her in her past life would not repeat themselves. Suddenly turning around, the protagonist told the eating maid that she would go with her, which surprised Dasha, and she couldn't believe what she heard. So she asked again if it was true, to which the protagonist agreed, saying they'd go to the imperial palace together. Tasha was overflowing with happiness as this would be her first time visiting the imperial palace, so she was very excited. Hearing this, Beniti was a little surprised that her maid had said it was the first time she was going to the imperial palace. But at the same moment, she remembered that the last time they had traveled, she had been wearing the best clothes they had ever worn. They were visiting cities for the first time, so they were excited to see everything around them. Suddenly, Beniti, with a serious voice, asked Tasha to wear the shabbiest clothes she had, which surprised the maid a little, and she asked if for this event they shouldn't wear the best clothes they had. However, the protagonist approaching the maid once again asked her to put on the ugliest clothes she owns. The maid was indignant and didn't understand why she had to do it, and she certainly didn't want to do it, which surprised the protagonist a little, and she asked why. To which the maid worriedly replied that the other maids would look down on her, so she's very worried about that too. So besides, she doesn't want to embarrass Beniti. When the protagonist heard that, she was a little surprised and immediately realized she didn't see it coming. How she really wanted to look as extravagant and ignorant as possible by dressing her maid like a beggar. So the girl didn't think Tasha would be so stubborn. Then the protagonist said that there was a reason for it, so Tasha should follow orders. The maid shouted that it was impossible, for there would be other maids and Heine, and she could not imagine what would happen after they saw her in such an ugly outfit. In addition, the main character after this incident, everyone will start to discuss and talk about them behind their backs, so the maid does not want anyone to offend her. At that moment, the protagonist remembered that Tasha probably has a personal score to settle with the maid Rosalie, so the maid doesn't want the other maid to see her in such a horrible outfit. Then, realizing that there was nothing to be done, she agreed with the maid and decided to wear what she wanted, which pleased Tasha greatly, and she began to thank Beniti, who didn't realize how a person's facial expression could change so quickly. When the protagonist left her house, she asked the maid to hold the suitcase because there was something they could use, so she mustn't lose it, which kind of surprised ours, and she wondered why the main character needed a change of clothes. To which the girl smirked and said she wanted to throw a little surprise party. Suddenly, some woman in a green dress who was worried sick about the main character asked her if she could do it without her. As it turned out, this woman was Beniti's mother, who was not so much willing to let her child go alone to the imperial palace, but the protagonist replied that she is quite manageable in the form of she is already 17 years old, and she is already a real lady. However, the woman was not at all reassured by this, and once again asked her daughter to be very careful and to hold herself with dignity there, which the protagonist immediately agreed to, even though she knew that she would have to give up her dignity when she got to the imperial palace. Meanwhile, the maid was still just delighted with the soft seat, and she still couldn't calm down as she realized that this was the first time she would be going to the imperial palace. The main character looking at it didn't understand how Tasha still hadn't calmed down, so she told the maid that she understood everything, but it wasn't worth it to stop and act like a redneck. When she heard that, Sasha immediately calmed down and started acting like a real lady, because it surprised Beniti a little. Finally, when they arrived at the Imperial Palace, they were simply amazed at the beauty of the place. All the items that were around them looked very luxurious, and tomorrow there were beautiful fountains everywhere. Also, the maid did not think that this palace is so huge, but Beniti was already tired of Tasha being surprised by everything, so she turned around and said that other people would be surprised when they saw such a chatty maid for the first time. Also, walking around the palace, maid did not understand how the main character knows the way so well, as if she had been here often, which irritated the girl a little, and she asked Tasha to shut up for 1 minute. In the 5th library of the main palace are mostly philosophical books, and this library is now right in front of the heroines. Suddenly, Beniti immediately went somewhere, which surprised the maid, and she immediately asked the girl what she was going to do at all, to which the girl approached Tasha and, taking the suitcase, asked her to wait here as she would be here soon. Then the maid was left alone in this palace, where she waited for the girl to come out of this library that no one usually enters. After a couple of minutes finally out of that room, Beniti, which greatly shocked all the guests of this palace, and they did not even understand someone and thought that the girl just went crazy. As it turned out, the main character just put on her dress that she found in Marianne's boutique. And it's that extravagant standout dress. Also, the girl thought that of all the visitors today, she would be the craziest one. At which point the maid started worrying about the protagonist, saying her dress looked too provocative. Besides, the Duchess has ordered her to behave with dignity and elegance. However, Beniti said that Tasha does not understand anything, because it is in this way you can show your dignity to the imperial family, which further shocked the maid, and she thought that the girl just went crazy. However, the protagonist really just wanted everyone to see her bad taste and bad upbringing. She needed a dress that would get her expelled, and she'd no longer be a candidate, which is why she's changed now. The main character ordered the maid to stop talking about her dress, but Tasha tried to convince her by saying that people might think badly of her, but she wasn't very interested in that. Even though Beniti and Tasha have been together since childhood, this is the first time the protagonist has shown anger toward her, but she was forced to do it because she had no other choice. In a couple of minutes, they were already in front of the doors to the main palace, so the protagonist said goodbye to her maid, who wished her luck and hoped that the imperial family would choose her. At that moment, slowly opening the doors, Beniti thought it was really starting to happen. Once inside, the girl saw a huge number of girls who were also candidates. These girls immediately looked at the main character, and they would be amazed at her dress. When Beniti noticed this, she was pleased, as this was exactly the reaction she had expected from the other candidates. Standing in one row for the girl's name, the candidates did not understand how the protagonist could dress like that, and just said that she was crazy as no one would wear such a provocative dress. Suddenly, some palace maid came out to the girls and said loudly that Her Majesty the Empress had arrived. Empress is graceful and beautiful, but certainly not merciful. Contrary to appearances, she is always ready to ask him quicker and unpleasant questions. It's not a rose, it's a sharpened dagger, so you have to be very careful with it. Then all the candidates together loudly said that it was a great honor for them to see the Empress herself. And the Empress added that she was very happy to share this beautiful morning together with the candidates. Then the maid asked all the girls to introduce themselves one by one. Since Beniti was first in line, she had to introduce herself first. So exhaling, she realized that last time she had picked eloquent words to be chosen. But this time she decided to use simple words and just introduce herself, saying that she is the only daughter in the Raishi family and her name is Beniti. Her speech today shocked all the candidates and the maid, because they couldn't believe that the candidate would introduce herself so briefly. Also, the Empress smilingly remarked that Miss Beniti had a very cheerful greeting. After all the maids had introduced themselves, the maid, holding some papers in her hands, said that they would now proceed to the examinations, so she asked them to go to the room assigned to them. When the protagonist walked into this room, she said that this place itself makes people nervous. Suddenly, the maid sat down at the table and decided she wanted to start the exam with Miss Beniti. At that moment, I didn't notice that the protagonist didn't sit up straight, so she said that she didn't have a very correct posture and asked her to stand up correctly, to which the protagonist smilingly replied that he just had a backache. So the maid was forced to tell her that she could get a special person to give her an injection and her pain would go away, Hearing this, Beniti was forced to sit up properly for them to begin the exam. No sooner had they even started the exam than the protagonist began to shake her legs, which greatly annoyed the maid, who did not understand why Beniti was doing all this. She started to order the girl to stop it, however, Beniti, shaking her legs even harder. Sorry to grow up, said it was a habit she couldn't get rid of. At that moment, the maid stood up abruptly, and with trembling hands went to the protagonist by the shoulders, declared that she definitely needed a shot of sedative. It surprised Beniti a little, and she realized she'd overreacted a little, so she should calm down a little, and at least see what the exam would be like. Taking a deep breath, the maid finally calmed down and was able to begin the exam. The first thing she wanted to know about was Beniti's knowledge of history. So the maid asked the protagonist to explain the significance of the fountain she had seen on the palace grounds, and the reason for its construction. This fountain is called Brave Women. When Emperor Alendra fought the dragons, some women came to the battlefield to give the soldiers gunpowder and weapons, but all were reduced to ashes. This imperial fountain is named after their deed, but the protagonist is well aware that she can't give the right answer to that question. So making a serious face, Beniti answered something, a great fountain of desire, which greatly surprised the maid and wondered why she thought so. At that moment, the girl replied that ordinary people make a wish at the fountain, and since it is the largest in the empire, it can be used to fulfill the most cherished dreams. This answer did not satisfy the maid at all, and then she decided to ask a second question, namely, why are there wings on the coat of arms of the empire? When Emperor Alendra defeated the dragon, the imperial family is under a small curse that will only disappear with them. A cursed child gains special powers, but he dies because he can't control them. And that's why many of the heirs of this family died, because they couldn't subdue this power. But there was a belief that an emperor would be born who would defeat the curse, and could revive even the most desolate wastelands. And at some point the principal stopped dying, and people thought the dragon curse was gone. About it is written in detail in the book History of the Empire, which is obligatory to forgiveness for every nobleman, so the protagonist knows every detail. Now she's saying that the wings mean the dragon is gone. What Stronger did not like the maid, and she said that this is all wrong, and the wings actually means the symbol of the curse of the dragon. Also, she recommended the main character to be sure to reread the history of the empire. After looking at the paper she had left, the woman realized they wouldn't have any more questions about history. So she asked Beniti a simple question, namely when her birthday was, to which she heard an instant reply, namely December 12th. Then the maid realized that the main character was born on the same day as the star. So she wondered if Beniti remembered what she did on her 8th birthday, which is a little surprising to the protagonist, and she asked the maid if she herself remembered what she was doing. Upon hearing this, the maid was a little surprised at Beniti's rudeness and stated that she was asking questions here. Also, she asked the girl if she knew what would happen to her if she continued to break the rules. Beniti replied that she would most likely be excluded from the selection ceremony, but the maid replied in a calm voice that she would not actually be expelled, but might even be accused of disrespecting the imperial family. And if the charge is proven, some of Raisha's lands will be returned to the empire. When the protagonist heard this, she was a little surprised, for it was the first time she had heard of such a rule, and she asked the maid if she had just made it up herself, which angered the woman still more. And holding up the papers, she said, no lady before her had ever behaved so thoughtlessly between ignorance and carelessness. There was a great difference. The woman stood up and left, adding that if Beniti continued to behave like this, she would have Mr. sue her for contempt. At that moment, the protagonist realized that she looked like a woman and became very angry. Besides, the Empress's servants are her face, so insulting the Countess can be equated with insulting Her Majesty. So she needs to get kicked out for terrible behavior. So Beniti turned around and asked the woman what she wanted to hear from her when she asked about her 8th birthday. And the girl didn't understand why the maid was threatening her when she could just expel her. The maid, looking out the window, replied that it was normal not to remember all the details of her childhood, but she asked her to think about the highlights of her childhood. Hearing this, Beniti realized that she could just ignore the question, and, as always, answer very simply. However, for some reason, she felt like it wasn't exactly a random question. Looking at the woman, the protagonist asked her if something had happened to her when she was 8 years old, but the maid replied that she had no idea what she was talking about, and how she could know what had happened to her, which left the main character in a stupor even more. And she asked what the question was about then, to which she heard the answer that part of the examination the maid was testing her memory, which greatly shocked Benity. As she left that room, the girl thought about the fact that after that Alika was acting strangely, talking confusedly and making mistakes all the time. So the protagonist didn't realize she'd fallen for this cold-blooded woman. She wanted to go home and find out more about it and get answers to her questions. After changing into her usual dress, Benity noticed that her maid was missing, so she started looking for her. The protagonist went outside and saw Natasha, who had fallen asleep right next to the Imperial Palace, which surprised her a little. Quickly running up to the girl, Benity immediately smashed her, saying she was done, and they could leave now. Suddenly turning around, the protagonist saw Rosalie, who was wearing a purple dress and was busy with something. At that moment, the protagonist grabbed her maid by the hand and started running somewhere fast. It turns out they hid behind the palace to hear what Rosalie was talking about. While listening, the protagonist heard another voice that sounded very pleasant to her. As it turned out, this angelic voice belonged to Princess Selena Reynos, who was enjoying the beautiful smell of flowers. Benity was shocked to see the princess in this place, since it was thanks to her that she was able to go back in time. So looking at the princess, she promised herself that she would be able to make things right, and she would not make the same old mistakes. While peeping at the girls, the protagonist heard Rosalie ask the princess if she had heard the latest news, namely about what dress Miss Benity was wearing. When Selena heard this, she became very interested and asked the girl what kind of dress she was wearing. She said that Rosalie whispered that it was a very provocative outfit, and she thought that soon there would be bad rumors about it. The girl also added that there were a lot of different diamonds on Benity's dress, and she didn't understand how her conscience could allow her to wear it, and that's why people will discuss her after this institute. Although Rosalie knows that Miss Benity is not an extravagant woman, she assumed that something simply happened to her. Meanwhile, the protagonist behind the wall was angry because she realized that Rosalie had changed everything. But once she calms down, she's glad her plan is going well. Suddenly, Benity heard the princess ask Rosalie if the protagonist happened to buy her dress at Marianne's boutique, which surprised the protagonist a bit, and she didn't understand how the princess could have guessed it before that. Selena added that this dress exists only in a single copy, so it is not accidentally called Golden Wave. Also, the princess secretly confessed to Rosalie that in fact, she wanted to buy this dress, but because it is the only copy, she did not have time to buy it. When the protagonist heard that, she was shocked and didn't understand why a princess would need such flashy clothes. Smirking, the princess added that Rosalie lives in Reynosa, is a fashion country, so the girl doesn't understand why Rosalie has no taste at all. The princess said that the diamonds on the board are not actually diamonds, but pheonite, a certain jeweler Hans who looks exactly like a diamond. Rosalie was greatly surprised at what she heard, didn't understand why the princess wanted to buy a dress with fake diamonds, to which the princess replied with a smirk that if she bought a dress with real diamonds on it, it would be unaffordable, and she wouldn't be able to wear it at all. Besides, people just want to wear sparkling stones too, and the price is too high for them. But thanks to pheonite, everything is possible. Now everyone can afford a beautiful and inexpensive dress, because pheonite is not inferior to others with its brilliance. Benity opened her mouth in shock and couldn't believe that the diamonds that were over that dress weren't real, so she asked Tasha if she had become aware of it, to which the maid replied that it was the first time she had heard either. Princess is Karzan's younger sister and is a year younger than Benity, known for her love of flowers and plants. But really her passion is dresses, soon to be an unnamed designer with superior skills in the fashion world. And during Benity's wedding, it turns out that the designer was actually Selena all along. She'll own a huge boutique on the outskirts of the Reynos Empire. And the reason she's hiding everything is because the Empress wanted Selena to be a normal princess. Meanwhile, the princess went on to say that they had managed to make an unbeatable outfit, and at a very affordable price, which is why Mariana had decided to create only one piece. So she wanted to find someone who knew fashion and understood the value of the pheonite. She wondered if people could tell the difference between a real stone and a fake one, and everyone refused to buy it because they thought it was diamonds. Therefore, everyone was afraid of pheonite. However, the missus still dared to buy this dress. At that moment, Rosalie wondered why the princess would not buy this dress first, To which the girl replied that Marianne had refused to sell it to her. The designer said she'd give the dress to the princess for free if no one bought it, but Benity already took it. In addition, the protagonist was not going to brag about this outfit, and she was actually just ahead of the fashion, having said that the princess immediately stopped and added that she did not correct the fashion, but became an innovator. Meanwhile, Benity, who listened to the whole thing, was in complete shock and couldn't understand how anyone could come to such conclusions about her. After a while, being at home surrounded by her family, the protagonist did not understand how she was able to get the status of a fashionista. Meanwhile, Tasha couldn't calm down, saying she had no idea Benity was thinking so deeply when she picked out the dress. Also, the mom of the main character was very happy for her daughter, saying that she is very smart. Also, the woman added that her daughter has become more perceptive. After that incident, all people started to look at the main character differently. At first, they thought she was crazy and immature, but after that, they called her cool and very smart. Now, however, she is not considered insane and her reputation has only improved. Fianite, which is cheaper than flour, became popular because of her, and now all the city girls are wearing them, and Benity's popularity is growing every day. So she decided that if she'd known about it, she never would have bought that dress. Now she finally understood why Marianne had grinned when the protagonist bought herself that dress. Back at the selection ceremony, the protagonist met Rosalie, who immediately asked the girl if she had picked out that gold dress for herself. She also praised Benity. It is said that she did not know that she knew so well about fashion, but at that moment pretended to be very interested in talking to Rosalie, although she did not really like Rosalie gossiping about her with the princess. Being in a row with the other candidates, the girl realized that now her chances of becoming a potential bride had increased even more. But she still has to follow her plan and needs to do this exam at all costs. In a couple of minutes, all the candidates were already outside, where they had to pass the second examination, namely to determine the type of tea. On the exam, they have to understand the variety by one smell, tell the useful properties and the method of cultivation. In her past life, it rained during an exam, but Benity calmly went on to take it by asking to bring her an umbrella, and Alika appreciated the act. But today, the girl intends to do exactly the opposite, in order for her grade to plummet. As she thought about it, she realized that thanks to her memories and her past life, she knew what was ahead of her unlike others, which meant that she could help someone with their exams. But because there are so many candidates, Benity doesn't even know who to choose, because even if there are good scores, all the titles below the Marquis or Duke's daughters will be eliminated, so it's worth finding someone who will be able to take her place. Looking to Benity's side, she noticed one plain, humble girl who was the daughter of the Marquis of Delete. She's the main character, then noticed another woman who had red hair, and she looked great. Her name was Rumina. This is a girl from an honest family who believes that lying only leads to trouble. Benity realizes that she can't be as honest as possible with Rumina, but she's not going to hurt her family either. Approaching the girl, the protagonist began whispering to her that she thought the second exam would be to guess the type of tea. She explained her hunch that there were tea tables on the exam site, so the questions would be related to that. She said that while the servants were preparing everything for the exam, they had a chance to prepare for it a little better. However, Rumina doesn't understand why Benity is telling her all this, since she doesn't like her, which surprised the protagonist a bit, and she said that it's not really true. The girl pointed her finger at the main character and approached her, and said that she didn't like her, so there wouldn't be any useless conversations between them. As she left, she added that she already knew everything about the exam. Benity was completely out of her depth, and didn't understand what these manners were. Besides, Rumina didn't even listen to the whole thing. Then, approaching Delita, the protagonist had already told her that this exam would be about tea. The girl was a little surprised by this, but still thanked the protagonist for this information. Benity also added that it might rain today, which she learned by chance from the wizard on the way here. The protagonist started to noodle on Delita's ears, saying that some wizards can predict the weather, but the girl looked at the sky and didn't understand how it could rain, since there were no clouds today. However, the protagonist approached the girl's ear and began whispering to her that if she saw a low-flying dragonfly during the exam, she should ask the examiners for an umbrella, which is what happens when the humidity rises. Then Benity immediately ran towards Rosalie, saying she had some very useful information. Namely, she told her that it might rain soon, and getting wet during the exam would even be helpful, which surprised the girl a little, and she didn't understand. Why go that far? However, the protagonist realized that if they were to take the exam in the rain, their chances of being selected would drop and they could be expelled. But Rosalie said that this way they had a chance to improve their reputation. Although she thought that if they got a cold, then they wouldn't get any points, which was good for Benity. But she still kept telling the girl that if they showed resilience and stood in the rain, they would earn the respect of the others. After thinking about it, Rosalie said that it was even a pretty good plan, which made the main character very happy since she was caught in a trap. Suddenly, Elika ordered all the candidates to gather as they would now be starting the second examination. Benity suddenly interrupted her by saying that her throat was dry and she wanted to have some tea, which surprised all the candidates a little, and they didn't understand why. After drinking some tea, the protagonist burped a little, which greatly surprised the examiner, who was just in complete shock at this behavior. She didn't understand how a candidate could behave like that at a selection ceremony. However, the protagonist apologetically realized that now her reputation will definitely decrease, and after the exam, everyone will ridicule her for this burp. A worried maid asked the girl if she had learned the etiquette of tea drinking, to which the girl replied that she was just very thirsty and couldn't stop. Then, wiping her face with a cloth, the woman asked Benity if she even knew what was the name of the tea she had just drunk, to which the protagonist replied that of course she knows. Artichoke tea has no flavor, weak taste, very expensive. That's why people can't buy it, but every nobleman knows it. But to further lower her reputation, the girl said she knew the name of this tea, which is bergamot. She explained her decision by saying she tasted bergamot when she drank the tea. Moving closer to the girl's ear, the maid began to say that last time she thought Benity was in no mood to take the exam, but this time she had gone too far. Nobles drink tea more often than water, and Elika can't so easily believe this nonsense about this tea being bergamot. So the woman doesn't understand what the protagonist wants to accomplish, but she's asked her to leave her out of it. Benity realized that the maid was even more angry and would treat her even worse, so she assumed that all she had to do was get wet in the rain, and then she would not be left behind and would be expelled. Meanwhile, Dalit looked away and noticed that the dragonflies were flying low. So she asked the observer to give her an umbrella, because judging by the low-flying dragonflies, it might rain soon. Seeing this, the observer was a little surprised at the girl's knowledge, and writing something in a document said that she would prepare it now. Benity, who was watching, rejoiced and wished for Delteta to continue and keep earning her points. After a while, as the protagonist expected, it started to rain, under which all the girls were forced to take the exam. Meanwhile, the protagonist was also in the rain and didn't understand why no one offered to bring her an umbrella, but it's good because everything goes according to plan. Suddenly, the maid approached the girl, saying that she wanted to look at her. The woman looked at the girl and said that the exam was over for her, which surprised Benity, and she wanted to know why. Elika explained to the girl that her body temperature had dropped a lot and it could affect her health. Also, the woman looked at Rumina and Rosalie, who were also waiting and all drenched, and ordered them to the hospital room. After a couple minutes in the hospital ward, the main character was in the same room with these girls, and they all had colds and were feeling sick. Also, when Benity asked Rumina what she was doing in the rain, the girl just started screaming hysterically, saying that she knew perfectly well and understood that the main character together with Rosalie wanted to get wet in the rain on purpose, which left Benity a little bit shocked. Rumina refers to the family of Viscount Askandar, who had a small estate, and the same charcoal was found near the back of it. The Viscount gradually expanded his business and made a large fortune, eventually gaining the status of duke. So Rosalie and the other nobles were displeased with Rumina's family. Originally, they had a low title, and because of her inferiority complex, she hated all the nobles, especially Benity and Rosalie. Sitting on a bed with a fever, the protagonist felt a little uncomfortable being in the same room with people who hate her. But thanks to this, she will miss the rest of the exams. The next day, Benity woke up to Tasha waking her up because he had great news. Namely, there was a very interesting article in the newspaper that sounds suggestive. Namely, the three girls did not refuse the exam, even in the pouring rain. Then the maid immediately praised the protagonist, saying that she is trying very hard to become the chosen one. Plus, The other candidates are being berated for being inhumane and how they could have ignored Beniti and not helped her at all. So all people say is that she's a princess who isn't afraid to get wet they could rely on. In the end, everything was turned on its head again, and the protagonist was already in the imperial palace again. There she immediately met Rumen, who smirked and realized that they had fallen in the rain on purpose in order to pass the second exam. Although, in fact, it's not like that, and the protagonist did not want it to happen that way. Plus, she doesn't want to be Karzan's woman, and Beniti doesn't understand why it's all going wrong. Suddenly, Alika came out in front of them holding some document and started talking about the girls who would be the main candidates for brides. She began to list the candidates who were able to pass the exams and become top candidates. And those candidates were Rumina, Rosalie, and Miss Beniti, which scared the main character a lot. After returning back to her home, the girl immediately met on the doorstep of her mother, who was happy for her daughter. They say that she did not even doubt that she could not cope with it. Also, Tasha added that they have no idea how much is being said about them now. Everyone thinks Beniti is a true crown princess who will serve her people well. However, the protagonist looked at her relatives and asked them to leave her alone now, which surprised your mom a little bit, and she just thought their daughter had a cold. In her room, staring at nothing, Beniti realized she needed to come up with a new plan. As she pondered, she remembered that the candidates were soon to take part in a contest to select the hereditary princess. But before that, the girls will meet their empress in a ceremony where they will be given the crowns of princess candidates. But if the girl does not participate in this ceremony, she will automatically be expelled. The protagonist would like to opt out, but unfortunately she can't just do that. There is no drastic reason for this. It would be most ridiculous for a young girl from a noble family to refuse the title of crown princess. Then, after a little more thought, Beniti started packing all her things to escape from her home. She brought an oil lamp, long-lasting food, and she's renting a carriage. After packing up all her things, she decided that she'd only come back when she was sure she'd been expelled. And by her calculations, that might take a week or so it was worth just holding out for a while. She assured herself that she would succeed, because she knew a lot of things she didn't know before. And once she finally carried out her plan, her future could change forever. Walking through the forest, she decided to check again where she was at the location she was heading to. After checking, she realized she had 4 days to go to Kubaran in the north. Her father would never have believed his daughter would ever go there on her own. No one from her family would look for her there. Beniti chose this place because Kubaran is home to her father's mentor, namely the Duke of Kubaran. While collecting her map, the protagonist thought that she should be both extremely careful and prepared for any unforeseen circumstances. Besides, the road to get there would be very difficult. She decided she should take a carriage to Vanessa, spend the night there, then take another and go to Rissos. She also thinks she can take a shortcut to Rissos, but then she'd have to spend the night in the open and then spend raw money on the road without stopping to get to Kubaran. Before going to end up the way the main character asked a man to get her a small book that is badly needed, this book turned out to be a basic guide for beginners travelers. Well, the guy did not understand why Miss needs this book. As it turned out, this guy's name was Hampton, and Beniti held her finger in front of her mouth and asked him not to tell anyone what she was up to, much less tell her parents. Whatever happens to her, he has to keep it a secret, so she asked him to promise to keep it a secret. Then Hampton agreed with Beniti, promising that he wouldn't tell anyone, and he also hoped that she would be all right and the Duke wouldn't have to worry about her. Thanks to this book that Hampton gave her, she can now find out where to rent a carriage and spend the night. On top of that, she has to walk another 2 hours to the parking lot, and she's already feeling bad now, and realized that she's probably in a bit of a hurry since she hasn't completely come down with her cold yet. Looking up at the night sky, Beniti thought there might not be any left on the other side yet, so she shouldn't mark and hurry to the parking lot. Gathering all her strength, the protagonist immediately ran to the parking lot, and after a while she finally got there, although she was very tired. She's already started to choose a carriage, and she spotted one very interesting carriage with a curtain so no one can see it, which is perfect for her. So slowly climbing into the carriage, she was glad that at last she would ride and not have to walk anymore. In the carriage, the protagonist didn't understand why they were moving so slowly. Suddenly, she looked to the side and saw that some stranger with a cloak had entered her carriage, which frightened her, and she did not understand what was happening. The man covered the girl's mouth and ordered her not to say anything, and he also added that, after the girl if she didn't scream. Looking at the guy's face, Beniti was greatly surprised since she remembered him and her past life. Namely, he is the crown prince of Karzan Rhaenys. He usually has black hair and red eyes, but he disguises himself as blonde when he wants to hide his real identity, like now. The protagonist was a little confused and didn't understand why he was doing all this. From her past life, she remembers that the day before the crown princess was announced, Karzan tried to escape but was caught, and it looks like he did the same this time. The same man who always treated Beniti coldly and was killed the first night after their wedding, the protagonist did not want to meet him anymore, so she ran away. But she did not understand why they met again. Suddenly the prince asked the protagonist to take him to Vanessa, which surprised the girl a little. She also remembered that he had been caught by the palace guard Vanessa when he wanted to escape in his past life, which means that the palace guards might be after them now, so the girl had to give it up because she didn't want to get caught. But the guy didn't want to give up so easily, and once again asked Beniti to help him, which surprised the protagonist a bit, as how can he ask for help after Rezko entered her carriage and gagged her by threatening her? Then Karzan admitted he was a little rough, and they've already started apologizing. However, the girl immediately interrupted him, saying that she didn't want his apology, so she demanded that he immediately get out of her carriage. Upon hearing this, the prince immediately took out a pile of gold coins, saying that in return for her help, she would receive these coins. Beniti looked at it and was surprised, and realized that with these coins she could live comfortably away from home. But she immediately came to her senses and refused this proposal, which greatly surprised the prince. In a state of bewilderment, he just stared at the girl, which made her feel not very comfortable, because she did not want to be near him. Then Karzan asked the girl in a calm voice if he could tell everybody when he got out of the carriage, which surprised the girl a little, and she wondered, to which the guy replied that her clothes looked ordinary. Well, you can see that it's a high-quality fabric that no commoner could afford. Also, the girl is riding in a rented carriage, no escort, and no family crest. So smirking, he thinks she's obviously trying to hide something. But in fact, this prince doesn't realize that the girl is trying to get away from him. So yelling at the guy, she asked him why he couldn't take the other carriage, and went into this one. To which Karzan replied that there were no more carriages available, and he had no choice, which made the protagonist even more wary. And she realized that she could not be allowed to be found out. She also realizes that the prince is one of those people who doesn't choose his methods. So she thinks he's really going to tell everyone that she escaped. She's also confused that they have to go to the same place, but she's happy that the destination isn't the same. So she was still forced to accept the prince's terms, but she only agreed to take him with her on one condition, namely, as soon as they arrived, they would immediately part ways. But it was as if the prince wasn't listening to the girl at all and was just staring out the window, which made Beniti angry. The protagonist realized that Vanessa was about a quarter of a day away, and they'd have to spend all that time together. Plus, it was the first time they'd ever communicated outside of any status. So Beniti decided she could afford to ask the prince one question, namely why he ran away. At that moment, the prince said in a loud voice that he didn't have to explain it, which convinced the girl even more that his character was not of the most pleasant kind. She also didn't understand why he kept looking out the window. She just wanted to hear his story, to which he replied that he didn't have to satisfy her curiosity. Beniti realized that during everything she had better not ask anything. Besides, she forgot that now they were on equal footing, so she apologized out of habit. After a while, they finally arrived at Vanessa's, where the protagonist got out of her carriage and thanked the driver and paid him for his work. Suddenly turning around to see where the principal was, she noticed that he had disappeared. But that was even better for her as she could finally relax. Looking at the night sky, the girl realized that she needed to find a place to stay as soon as possible. But since she has a guidebook for beginner travelers, she can easily do it. The next morning she woke up to find her things stolen while she slept. She asked the innkeeper for money and he said he wouldn't do it, it's all so stupid. At that moment Beniti she yesterday shouted, saying something is not her fault that things were stolen. However, the man calmly in a voice asked the girl to complain to the city department if she is not satisfied, and he does not give a damn about it at all. But then she came across some merchant who wanted to buy her clothes from Beniti, saying they could get a lot of money. Since the protagonist had no other choice, she was forced to give up and sell her clothes. But the merchant who took her clothes never returned. He also looked at the innkeeper and smilingly asked Beniti to get out of here, which surprised the girl, so she didn't even know where to go. Besides, it was raining outside and she didn't know what to do in this situation at all. At first, she wanted to complain to the city government, but then her family would find out for sure, and the news would spread quickly that Miss Beniti had run away from home on the day the princess candidates were announced. So when she got in over her head, she didn't even know what to do. Also, looking at her dress, which she got from the merchant to whom she had given her beautiful dress, Beniti was simply furious since it was a shabby dress. And as soon as she changed into this garment, her noble miss immediately disappeared. She remembered Karzan and realized she wasn't going to stay on the streets, and to do that, she needed to find a prince. Just after lunch at Baba's, Vanessa's most famous joint, he was caught by a search party. So the protagonist decided she had to find him first, and she ran straight to this bar to meet him. Finally reaching this bar, she noticed that the prince wasn't here yet, which shocked her a bit. She also smelled a nice aroma of food, but because she was poor now, she couldn't even afford a piece of bread. She suddenly noticed Karzan walking calmly through the city and heading to that bar. Then Beniti immediately jumped on him and stopped him from going in there under any circumstances. It surprised the guy a little, and he almost used his magic on the girl. Beniti started to ask the guy to help her, but the prince was a little puzzled. He didn't understand why he should help a commoner. But the girl immediately reminded him that she had saved him yesterday, and thanks to her, he was able to get here. At that moment, the guy smirking said that it was a very interesting sight. Also, he did not understand what happened to the heroine because one day ago, she was wearing a beautiful, luxurious dress, and now she looks like a poor man. Beniti replied that her money had been stolen, and then her clothes had been taken, which surprised the guy a bit, and he grinned and said that even his cat wouldn't do something that stupid. His cat's name is Belle. She is a fat, pampered animal who can't do anything on her own. So hearing this, the protagonist stretches a bit since she thought the prince was saying that even his cat is healthier than she is, so he wanted to know the details of what had happened to her. At that moment, Beniti felt very uncomfortable and worried she told him that things were gone when she woke up. The guy smilingly realized what was going on and said that it would be strange if a noblewoman without a servant stayed at the inn and nothing happened to her. So he explained to the girl that they had planned to rob her from the very beginning. At that moment, Beniti finally realized why that stupid innkeeper had chased her out of there. So I feel very comfortable. She asked Karzan for help. But the prince showed his palm and said he didn't want to help her. He explained that he'd already paid her to drive him here yesterday, so now his conscience was clear. Then the enraged protagonist started threatening the prince, saying that if he didn't help her, she'd tell everyone that he'd snuck into her carriage. And it seems she's not the only noblewoman here who's run away from home. But the guy just started walking away saying she can do whatever she wants, which left Beniti in a stupor. The protagonist was in complete shock and started shouting at the guy in the back say that she is not kidding and really going to tell everything. But the principal realizes that the girl in such a way no one will believe, so he is sure that no one will find him. Suddenly, the girl said she knew what was looking for him here, which made the guy stop and look at the girl excitedly. Beniti began to tell that she had seen people in uniforms with the imperial crest, and they said they were looking for a blue-eyed blonde man, so she thought they might be talking about him. The girl also added that they said they were coming here, so she decided to get ahead of them and warn the prince. On hearing this, Karzan was no longer so indifferent to the girl and asked where she had to get to which the girl said she had to get to Kubaran, so she simply asked for money to hire a carriage. At that moment, the man was a bit in shock and could not even believe what he heard, as he was also going to Kubaran, which greatly shocked Beniti. She didn't understand why the prince needed to go exactly where she was going. Meanwhile, Karzan pondered and decided he was ready to take the girl there. He turned around and added that he was willing to pay for everything, but he didn't like debt, so he never got into it. The guy also added that he didn't have much money left because he had given it to someone, so he suggested that the girl just go to Kubaran together. After a while in the prince's carriage, Beniti didn't understand why she was always so lucky. Suddenly, Karzan came into the carriage and told them that they were going to spend the night outside tonight. He was going to walk a little through the forest of Lojbina, as there would be a camp area there. This place is pretty safe, so they don't have to worry about their safety. Hearing this, Beniti was a little surprised by the prince's concern, and couldn't believe that he was trying to comfort her since it was very different from his normal character. Besides, normally, he would never do such a thing. After he got into the carriage, the protagonist asked him why he was going to Kubaran. But the guy, instead of answering the question, asked the girl why she ran away from her house. What the girl said she would be back there in a couple days. Although really she just wants their wedding not to happen. At which point she told the prince that she was the first to pop the question. To which the prince replied that he just wants to avoid the engagement, which left the protagonist just in a stupor. And there is the most interesting thing why he wants to avoid the engagement. Karzan said something to do with the fact that he doesn't even know his chosen one. But that's not all. Also, he didn't understand why he should tell some girl he doesn't know such an important detail to a girl he doesn't know. To which the girl replied that he'd started it, not understanding why he was asking such strange questions. Beniti suddenly noticed some kind of blue book in his hand and assumed something might be a magic textbook. All members of the imperial family can use magic. It's something that's passed down through the generations, and even Karzan stands out among them. But he's always absorbed in his studies and never lets the books out of his hands. So the main character wondered why someone would kill the prince. She has so many questions, but unfortunately she won't get the answers to all these questions anytime soon. After a while they managed to get to the camp where there were already some people who were going to spend the night there. Beniti was very surprised when she came to this place, as she had heard about it before, but never been here, and it looks like something summer camp. Karzan suddenly approached the girl, offering her a sandwich since she hadn't eaten anything all day, and was probably very hungry now. Eating this sandwich, Beniti listened as the prince told her that there were many people here so the beasts would not come near them, and she should not be afraid to sleep. Finally finished eating her sandwich, the girl intended to go to bed, but for that she needed a sleeping bag, to which the prince replied that there was no such thing, and there was only a blanket. This left Beniti in a stupor, as she remembered Karzan telling her that he had taken everything he needed, to which the guy replied that someone had taken all the money, so he couldn't buy everything. The girl was utterly bewildered and did not understand how they would then sleep in this weather. After a while, all the characters were asleep except the main character, who couldn't sleep at all. She realized that in theory they were strangers here. She never thought she'd sleep with someone she hadn't even slept with on her wedding night, and she tossed and turned in bed all night. Karzan stood up abruptly and started yelling at the girl, telling her to stop tossing and turning as it was disturbing his sleep. Suddenly the guy ran outside and started running in some direction, which left the girl in shock. After literally a couple seconds, he came right back in bringing the girl some object. She was puzzled. She didn't understand what this object was, to which the guy replied something hot stone he had brought it so that the protagonist could sleep properly and not disturb his own sleep, for which the girl thanked him. I don't know why he's so kind, and so different from the prince she married in her previous life. When the heroes woke up in the morning, they immediately saw the private carriage driver who said that he had slept very well, thanks to the warm stone that the young gentleman had given him. Then Karzan, getting out of his carriage, asked a man to fetch him water for his breakfast, for he wanted soup and pancakes, to which the servant replied that he would do so immediately. However, the prince added that he doesn't need someone to make this soup instead, as he wants to make it himself, much to the man's surprise. At the same time, Beniti also woke up and didn't understand how he was going to cook it all himself. But the Duke asked the girl not to worry as he wasn't going to poison the food. After a while, the prince prepared pancakes, which were surprisingly delicious, and the girl and the servant were delighted with the taste of these pancakes. Eating his beautiful pancakes, Beniti realized that Karzan could still cook, and cook so well, but she didn't understand how the press could have learned it. Meanwhile, Karzan, holding water in his hands, asked the heroes to take their time as the food was very hot. Beniti was in complete shock, and didn't understand how this person could change so drastically and become so kind. And this is not someone she knew in her past life. In her past life, she had hoped he would at least give her a hand if she accidentally fell. But no, he would walk away when he saw her like this. Even when she cut herself on the thorns of the roses he had left or fell a fountain, he always threw her down. Plus, he tried not to touch her at official events. When she sent the letter saying she was going to visit him, there was a scary snake waiting at the door to keep her out of his room. Now Tarzan was different both in appearance and character, but the girl did not understand why he had been so cruel to her then. At night of this day, the heroes were in Rissos, or some man said that in the fall there are a lot of tourists here, but they unfortunately have no rooms left at this late hour. So he asked the heroes to look for another place to spend the night. Beniti was very upset about this and didn't even know what they should do. Meanwhile, the principal asked Kuchera to go to the inn with the stables. He also approached the girl and said they had no choice but to go to the convent. When they turned around, they saw a sign that said there was a monastery. But the place was so ruined that they didn't even want to go there. But because of the situation, they were forced to do so. Walking through the monastery, they were watched by some men who were watching the heroes closely, as if they intended to do something. At the same time, Beniti felt very uncomfortable as the atmosphere here is scary and very frightening. So instinctively, she grabbed Tarzan's hand, which surprised him a lot. When she finally realized what she was doing, she immediately distanced herself from him, saying that she had touched a member of the imperial family without permission, which is a real crime. Then she immediately apologized to the prince. The guy calmly ordered the girl not to stick it to him. Beniti started making excuses, saying she was just scared and didn't really want to do it. Suddenly, Tarzan noticed the church and immediately realized that they had finally arrived. But the girl who was next to him did not understand why he did not go forward. Then she decided she would be braver and go first. But the prince immediately stopped her and asked her to stop. She was a little frightened by this and didn't understand what he was doing because he had said before that they shouldn't touch each other, and now he was holding her hand. But the prince explained to the girl that he just had a bad feeling about it. Worried, Beniti didn't understand why this was happening now, like when it's already scary. But Tarzan said something unrelated, and he feels like there's something wrong with the monastery. He also took a closer look at the building and noticed that the lights were off, which the girl agreed with, and hugged him from behind again. Tarzan, touching Beniti's hand, asked her to stay here as he intends to go inside and explore this monastery. However, the girl immediately stopped him, saying that it could be very dangerous. But the prince called her a coward. I do not understand how she even dared to run away from home. Beniti began to explain to him something might be very dangerous as there is no light there, to which the half replied that although it is scary, but he is obliged to go there and explore. When the protagonist was shocked and realized that the crown prince was putting himself in great danger, but no matter how much she explained to him, he wouldn't listen. Thanks to her, the search party didn't pick up Tarzan, so she doesn't know what the future holds. Besides, someone already wants to deal with him. Her father always praised Tarzan, thinking that such a person is born once in 1,000 years, and many people thought the same, so all the people had nothing to do but mourn. Then she decided she wasn't going to let anyone deal with him so easily, and it was worth keeping her promise to the princess, so she started begging the prince not to go there. She'd rather sleep outside. Besides, this place is very scary and dangerous. But Tarzan didn't listen, and started to slowly move away from the girl. Suddenly she hugged him from behind, trying to stop him, which shocked him a lot, not understanding how to react. He didn't understand at first how she dared to touch him, but Beniti was still trying to hold him back, though she wasn't very good at it. Suddenly some man approached the heroes, saying that it is forbidden to go there. He also added that it is forbidden to approach the monastery now. The heroes wondered why they could not enter the monastery, to which the stranger explained to the heroes that all the monks had died after eating a sick pig. Their bodies are still inside the monastery, so no one is allowed in.